Welcome back to Genesis. Today we're doing Genesis 6, 1 to 8. Now, Genesis 6 is actually one of the most fun chapters in the entire Bible to read if you like debate. Okay, so for those of you not already familiar with this chapter, well, you came to the right place. Before reading, though, we're going to remind ourselves of a few things. Remember those initial questions we talked about at the beginning of Genesis 1. First, Moses is the author of this text, and he's writing it to the Hebrews, the people who just spent the last 430 years as slaves in Egypt. And he's unfolding for them their history. And that history begins at the beginning of the world, just like the history of all of us began at the beginning of the world. In this story, he has conspicuously deleted the gods of Egypt. But don't get the idea that Moses is stripping away the whole concept of spiritual world. I mean, not at all. His story is filled with spiritual beings. I mean, the first of these, obviously, is God himself. But in chapter 3, Eve is tempted by the snake, the Nahash, a spiritual being that's quite familiar to the Hebrews, who they referred to in Egypt as the villainous god Apep. Next, when God expels the man and the woman from his garden, he places a flashing sword of fire and a pair of cherubim at the entrance. The cherubim, of course, are not physical beings, at least not in their natural form. So as we step into chapter 6, we already have a small collection of supernatural things, supernatural beings mostly, and then one very interesting sword. For the vantage point of naturalistic people living in the 21st century, this is a bit weird. But that weirdness is the weirdness that we feel about it is what it's revealing is actually our own anti-spiritual bias. It says nothing about them. It just indicates that they were open to a world with spirituality, open to a world where things happen that they didn't understand. But we ourselves in our naturalistic world have tried to scrub the universe of anything, well, frankly, beyond our power. For the Hebrews, though, no such bias existed. Moses tells them about the creatures made on the earth and about creatures that belonged in the heavens with God. These creatures of the heavens were spirit, and they were presumably much more powerful than the creatures on the earth. If for no other reason, the fact that creatures on the earth, I mean, how do you interact with creatures in the spiritual realm, whereas creatures in the spiritual realm apparently can interact with you? At the very least, that gives them a serious leg up. When the Hebrews looked up at the stars and the sun and the moon, this is what they naturally would have understood those things to be. They would have seen them as spirits or as creatures in the heavens. And it was only later in time when people would discover that actually, no, it turns out they also are in the natural realm. Well, what we consider the natural realm. They are part of this universe, this physical universe, as opposed to the other universe. But at this point in time, Moses is not concerned with explaining this to the people. Moses himself probably didn't know because God wasn't concerned with explaining that to Moses. After all, God's not trying to give Moses or the Hebrews an astronomy lesson. He's trying to build a moral people for himself. He knew people would figure things out as they went along when it came to the science-y parts of things. Also remember that Genesis 6 is coming directly on the heels of Genesis 5. You can't start at the beginning of Genesis 6 and say, oh, this is the beginning of the story. Not at all. These things are not written like chapters. They're not written like chapters in a book that you or I would read. You can't just, pick up this book and say, aha, chapter 21. And so it's starting something completely different than chapter 20. That's not how they would break it up. So chapter 6 follows directly from chapter 5. You have to think about the end of chapter 5 as the context for chapter 6. So the statement that Lamech made about Noah at his birth is the last idea that is in the reader's mind when chapter 6 begins. This child will bring us relief from toil and laboring in the earth that was cursed by the Lord. It's therefore with these things in mind that we read. So we're going to start in verses 1 through 3. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. That's because they were. And they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, or shall not contend in or contend against man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Now, in English, it looks like the statements in verses 1 and 2, that is here, are causative to God's statement in verse 3. That is, the Lord is punishing man with early death for the sons of God marrying the daughters of man. However, this isn't necessarily the case. This is a conclusion that may or may not be warranted, depending upon your interpretation of what's going on in verses 1 and 2. Namely this: who are the sons of God? We're not talking about who the Nephilim are in verse 4 yet. We haven't gotten there. These guys, the Nephilim, are totally dependent upon who the sons of God are. You need to figure that part out first. And this is where we enter the debates. Historically, there are three primary ways to see who the sons of God are. A. The sons of God are spiritual beings. They could be angels, or they could be what are called watchers, or members of what is called the divine council of God. There are various terms that people have used to describe them, but that they would be spiritual beings. B. The sons of God may be the righteous. Sometimes this is correlated exclusively with the descendants of Seth versus the descendants of Cain, though I think the separation between the descendant lines is unwarranted by the text, particularly when you look back at Cain's line and it looks like these guys may have returned to God, so what gives? Probably isn't a Seth-Cain correlative, but the question of is it the righteous versus the unrighteous? C. 3. The sons of God are powerful men such as kings or rulers, and they would be people with earthly authority. That is, the ones who are exercising the authority that God has given them over others, hence the sons of God. And all three of these ideas, as it turns out, have really good solid backing. First, spiritual beings. The term sons of God throughout the Old Testament consistently refers to a group of spiritual beings that seem to hold some type of counsel in the heavens. For example, Job 1:6 says, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser also came among them. They come, as the text says, to present themselves before the Lord, which is something that wouldn't be happening on earth, but that would be happening in the heavens. It clearly is not being done by humans. People who hold to this idea tend to see a whole lot of the spiritual world coming out of the text of the Old Testament. The earth ends up looking more like a battlefield where the forces of truth and lies are in continual conflict, starting with the original contention between truth and lie in Genesis 3 with the Nahash, and continuing right through Ephesians 6:12, where the Apostle Paul says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And of course, then all the way through the end of Revelation. Before the end of the first century, there was an apparent universal agreement that the sons of God were spirit beings or were angels of some sort. This was the idea espoused in various Jewish writings shortly before the coming of Christ, namely the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, yes, the Book of Jubilees, and 2nd Baruch. This also seems to be what Jude and Peter both believed from reading their own letters. That'd be 2nd Peter and Jude. Most of the early church fathers also held this view. People like Clement of Rome and Eusebius of Caesarea, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and others. Certain fathers like Julius Africanus disagreed, stating that these sons of God were human, but their view is the distinct minority position. And this view held firmly in the church until it shifted heavily in the 1800s with the rise of naturalism, which taught that anything spiritual is de facto mythology, and that only fools and simpletons and backwards barbarians think angels are real. Well, okay, second view, the righteous. This view is not based upon evidence from the Old Testament, rather evidence from the New Testament. 14 times in the New Testament, those who follow Christ are called sons of God, or, depending upon your translation, children of God, same term. This idea is so intensive in the New Testament that we can't help but draw the idea back into Genesis 6. However, is that fair to do? I mean, did Moses have this idea in his head? And the answer is actually, maybe? If you drop back to Genesis 3, you can see in the curse of the Nahash that Moses is laying out the promise of one born of woman who will destroy the Nahash. Moses is clear that this is coming, but the one born of woman never appears in Moses' lifetime, in spite of the fact that he alludes to different people hoping that the time had come. Rather, Moses is accepting that he doesn't have the end of the story. Likewise, it's reasonable that Moses may have been writing about the sons of God, understanding that this is a group of people with a status he doesn't necessarily understand, but will be revealed later. Now, if this idea seems a bit odd, in light of the Old Testament talking about the sons of God already, that's okay. It's got a couple of shortcomings, which I'll try to wrap up in a bit. But first, the third option. Powerful men, like kings and rulers and those who lord it over others. And this idea is actually argued based upon history, not the text. You see, pharaohs called themselves the sons of the gods. Not one pharaoh, but pretty much all of them. It was a rather common idea at the time that rulers, kings, and whatnot would identify themselves as the sons of whatever the gods were. They were special, you see, because they were descended from the divine. Therefore, you have to do what they tell you. So rather than looking at Job, we're told you should look at the context in which Moses and the Hebrews lived. And wouldn't that be sensible? I mean, that's literally what we're doing right now, is looking at the context in which they lived to see how would the Hebrews have read this. So it's inescapable to say, well, if the Hebrews heard the term sons of God, what would come immediately to their mind? Pharaoh. That's what would come to their mind first. So yes, of course, you would immediately think of Pharaoh. So those are the three competing ideas, and they all seem reasonable, and they all seem mutually exclusive. So if one is true, then the other two are false. So which is it? So follow along with me for a moment. Let's take option A. It says that the Old Testament reliably uses sons of God to refer to spiritual beings that hold counsel with God in heaven. But the New Testament says, option B, that the sons of God refers to humans that follow Jesus Christ. Thus, a reasonable conclusion is that when we leave this world, that we will join with, or later on you could learn about replacing even, the sons of God that hold counsel with God in heaven. Maybe we join them, maybe we replace them, maybe we replace some of them and the other is still there, or however that works. But we then hold counsel with God. Now, is there any reason to think that this isn't true? Or does your read in the New Testament sound exactly like mine does, which is, well, isn't that basically what we already know we're going to do? We're going to go to heaven and we're going to be with Jesus Christ forever. So wouldn't we be holding counsel with God? Like automatically, like de facto? I mean, well, maybe the sons of God in the Old Testament, sons of God in the New Testament aren't contradictory at all. Maybe they're very complementary to each other. In fact, you could say that Adam and Eve, before they sinned, held counsel with God in the Garden of Eden. After all, what else was God doing when he was walking through the garden in the cool of the day, except looking for Adam and Eve to hold counsel with? To come chat, to talk. Hey, how are things going? Okay. So that's well enough. So you can reconcile those two things. Ooh, but there's that pesky third option. That the sons of, let's see here. What about Pharaoh? You know, I mean, Pharaoh was very much the in-your-face sons of the gods. Well, one resolution might be to say that Pharaoh was simply lying. That's a great conclusion. I got to tell you, I love it. The only problem is Moses doesn't say that. He just doesn't go that direction. He just doesn't say it at all. He doesn't say that pharaohs were lying about their lineage. He doesn't mention them. Rather, he cites a group of beings with the same title that pharaohs used. So this is where I'm going to reach my conclusion about this question and tie the two of these things together. Moses is certainly referencing a term that the Hebrews would have immediately attributed to Pharaoh. Absolutely no doubt about it. But he intentionally doesn't mention Pharaoh. Rather, he says exactly what the sons of God were doing, and then he allows people to draw obvious conclusions about the pharaohs based upon those statements. And in fact, this is actually the very same thing that Moses did with Ra, the god Ra. He didn't mention him in Genesis 1 during the creation of the sun. He didn't say that Ra wasn't the sun. He didn't say that the sun wasn't Ra. If you wanted to call the sun Ra, fine. But do that knowing that he's powerless to do anything that God has not assigned him to do. If the sun is Ra, then Ra is God's slave. This is the same thing that Moses did with the snake in Genesis 3. He didn't say that Apep was not the Nahash, nor that Nahash was not Apep. If you want to call Nahash Apep, fine. But do that knowing that he is a cursed, slithering worm under the feet of a coming triumphal human victor, the seed of the woman. He's a monster in his heart, but he's no threat to those who cling to God's words. That is, he is a liar, and if you cling to the truth coming from God, the liar is no threat to you. And so Moses comes to the idea of Pharaoh being the sons of the gods. Moses isn't saying that Pharaoh isn't one of the sons of God. If you want to call him that, fine. But do it knowing that he's just one claimant in a much larger group of very real sons of God who created a world worthy of destruction. In fact, it was in light of the appearance of these sons of God, a title that Pharaoh was applying to himself, that God said he would severely limit the life of man. So does that paint Pharaoh in a good light, or does that paint Pharaoh in a bad light? Now, does that answer the question of whether or not the sons of God are angels or men back in Genesis 6? I think Moses might have answered it this way. Doesn't matter. I mean, look at what they did to the world. And that, I think, is probably the wise answer. But that answer just doesn't satisfy my curiosity. However, it does leave us an explanation for why Pharaoh could be called one of the sons of the gods without Moses making a big deal of it. So in the end, I'm left with option A with a slathering of B and some sprinkling of C. The sons of God in Genesis 6 are exactly what they are in Job 1. They're powerful spiritual beings. They're also the precursor group to what the followers of Christ shall one day become, beings who stand in the presence of God and report to him face to face. They're also what Pharaoh claimed to be. So we're going to enter the Nephilim. Verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. I have to say that twice. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So we enter the Nephilim, everyone's favorite mysterious group, except for the reasonable people like my wife, who think the entire topic is just worth rolling her eyes over. She much prefers that previous answer, the doesn't matter, look at what they did to the world. So if the sons of God are actually spiritual beings who don't have physical bodies, then what's happening here? How are they making babies with humans? I mean, do they have DNA? Is it like spirit DNA? How exactly does that work? You're going to have to be satisfied that Moses isn't going to give you that much information. I mean, when does he ever? He's far more interested in what the instigating actions are that lead to God's responses than he is with filling in all those details. This is just like in the prior stories. He doesn't tell us how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before the fall. He doesn't tell us at all. He doesn't tell us how Cain and Abel learned how to offer sacrifices or what company they used for their cable TV. We just don't know these things. The broad strokes of the brush of history are all we are going to get. Everything else is in the fog of history. Now, do I like that? No. I want there to be really cool details. We're just not going to get them. So while we can say that the angelic beings are making babies with humans, we're not going to get some great answers to great questions like how they did it. Did they give themselves physical bodies? I don't know. Did they possess other humans? No idea. I mean, if I were to guess, I would think they were inhabiting other humans, and that resolves all kinds of questions. But again, don't know. There is an old idea, though, that they had created a hybrid race, and it was because of this that God used such drastic measures to cleanse the earth. But again, that old idea was brought about by people who are trying to answer the very same question you and I have. It's not because they had more knowledge, it's that they had the same lack of knowledge. They're just trying to fill in a lot of I don't knows. So they made some great stories. Regarding the Nephilim, though, the Nephilim, you've probably heard of the sons of God. But nowhere in the text does it actually say that they're descendants of the sons of God and the daughters of man. Quite to the contrary, verse 4 states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also thereafter. On the earth in those days and also afterward. Normally, we say, well, this is talking about before and after the flood, but that's not what it says. It tells us, the flood's not even in the picture yet. It tells us in that very same verse exactly what we're before and after. Before and after when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. So if they were descendant from the sons of God and the daughters of men, why were they there before that happened? And then we get at the end there. These, presumably the Nephilim, were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, Moses doesn't say that these guys are evil. Just says that they were heroes and they were well known. Were they good heroes and well known, or were they bad heroes and well known? Don't know. This is all we get about the Nephilim. So, given all the various people who lived before the flood, why did Moses bring them up? Why would he bother talking about the sons of God and the Nephilim? Surely there were like other groups of people, right? Lots of groups of people. One reason alone, because the Hebrews already knew about them. Think of this. Moses is going steadily through chunks of mythology that they already have in their minds from living in Egypt. Mythology that the Hebrews are already well acquainted with, and he's fixing things in that mythology. The heavens and the earth, they didn't come about the way the Egyptians said. They came about like this. The sun, it didn't come about the way they said. The sun obeys God. Humans were made this way. The tree of life is not that, it's actually this. The Nahash is actually like that. Then here in chapter 6, he tells the Hebrews about the sons of God, a term they already know, which is applied to the pharaohs and the kings. And he says, the sons of God are like this. And then he tells us about the Nephilim, a term they already knew. The Nephilim, you see, were great and powerful people, like he says, the heroes of old. They were like the warriors of the first age in Middle Earth, or the Jedi of the Old Republic, or demigods of the Greeks. They were these great, amazing people, and they were unique and powerful, probably from mythic stories or legends that were still around at that time in history, but have been completely forgotten to us today, which is very sad because they were probably really cool stories. We could make up a few, but they wouldn't be the originals, and there's just something nice about the originals. But they were the great, super ancient heroes that are completely lost to us. Now, how do we know the Hebrews thought about the Nephilim this way? Well, because they told us. In Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 to 33. In Numbers 13, the spies are coming back from the promised land, where they had been sent into by Moses to scout out the land, figure out what's going on in there. They come back and they're terrified. They didn't want to attack into the promised land because the people living in that land were powerful. They didn't want to die. I mean, I can imagine that might be a powerful motivator. They didn't want to go in and get killed. So they spread around to report to the people, that is the Hebrews, to convince Moses to turn back. Don't go in there. And here's what they said. This is the rumor that they spread to the people. If you know anything about rumors, then you know the veracity of the rumor probably isn't very good. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw were of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. It mentions the descendants of Anak because they did live in the land. There's no reason to think that they're being literal or truthful in their description at all. Instead, it's strong and colorful, completely over the top. The land devours those living in it. I mean, really, does it actually? No. It was lush and beautiful. We seemed like grasshoppers. Actually, no. I mean, you were probably shorter, but all the Canaanites and all those other people weren't towering 600 feet over your head. That's not the way it was. So it's only reasonable to conclude that the rest of their claims, the use of the word, for example, Nephilim, were also intended to add another layer of terror that was equally untrue. So what are we saying here? What am I saying is, merely by invoking the term Nephilim, they were going to the extreme of how powerful those warriors were. In other words, they weren't the Nephilim. They're supposed to be like the Nephilim. Oh, we saw those guys there. No, you didn't. They weren't there. Now, what about the statement about Anak coming from the Nephilim that was in the middle of their report? Either this is what they were actually reporting, and I'm inclined to think that's the case. So this is the first option, that they were actually reporting as part of the report that, hey, those descendants of Anak, they actually come directly from the Nephilim. I mean, how would they actually know this? I mean, how would they know? Did they go up to the descendants of Anak and ask them? Well, yeah, our ancestors, they were the heroes of old. I mean, they were the great ones. They were the amazing ones. They were super powerful. That's who our ancestors were. Your ancestors stink. You know, so it's like my daddy's bigger than your daddy kind of stuff. You know, so I'm inclined to think, you know, based upon the flow of the passage, that this is actually what they said. You know, that they were saying like, these guys they're like huge and powerful, and they're like dragon fire gods from the first age, and they have Balrogs with them, and like cave trolls and things, and I saw one of them carrying Excalibur. Okay, yeah, probably not, but you can see how if they're trying to spread a rumor, that they might be inclined to stretch the truth all the way into the lie zone. But what if this was the second option, that this statement about Anak coming from the Nephilim was not actually part of their claim, but was actually an editorial note? See, there are a lot of places in the Old Testament, particularly in the Pentateuch, where an editor will stick a note into the passage to explain something. Moses probably did this himself, and there are editors after him who would have put a note there to explain something to people later, what something meant, you know, so that you actually had a clue what you were reading. It's like, where did these Anak guys come from, for example? Well, just to let you know, Anak was descended from the Nephilim. Well, that's gonna move us on to the next idea. I mean, first of all, there's already a place further up in the chapter where you could have put that note in when Anak is introduced. That would have been the right place to put a note if you were an editor. But it's easy to argue, well, the guy just didn't do it that way. He just put it in a different space. So what do we do with that? Well, we're going to ask ourselves a different question. Are the Nephilim actually a people group? And this is actually a really good question. You see, if the Nephilim were a people group, then Genesis 6 is the first place where this people group is mentioned. The descendants of Cain were not called the Cainites, in spite of the fact that Moses could have said that. He doesn't. The descendants of Shem are not the Shemites. They're just simply all of us. They're not identified by different tribe or different race. He doesn't use tribal terms. Because before the flood, there's no indication that society's broken apart this way. And tribalism is a feature that Moses leaves out of the text until after the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And then he starts talking about the breakout of the tribes, the different tribes of men. Not only that, but the term Nephilim doesn't have a patriarch to it. The term for the sons of Anak, for example, the Anakians or the Anakites, they come from a guy named Anak. That's his name. The Hebrews come from a guy named Eber. That would be the Hebrews, from Eber. The Egyptians come from a guy named Egypt. The Israelites come from Israel. So where do the Nephilim come from? Nephi? Instead, Moses tells us the qualifications to be one of the Nephilim. They were the heroes, men of renown. So they're far more like, say, the Jedi than they are like elves. You know, if you're an elf, you're special because you're born an elf. If you're a Jedi, you know, you didn't come, your parents weren't Jedi, right? So these were great men selected out of a much larger population. You know, kind of like special forces guys in U.S. military. You know, you just don't have this descent line of special forces. They weren't born into the name Nephilim. Now, what do you do with the name itself? The word Nephilim means, as close as we can tell, the fallen ones. And that could refer to them being the fallen ones, or it could mean that they're the ones who cause other people to fall. And if they're the ones who fall, it could be that they've fallen morally, or it might mean that they fall before a god. And if they're falling before a god, it could mean voluntarily in worship, or it might mean involuntarily that God knocks them down. Then, of course, we have other problems with this in that Moses didn't pick the term Nephilim. I mean, the people already knew the term Nephilim, so it would have been around when Moses was born. And if they already knew that term, which we know from Numbers 13, then that means it may not even have been originally a Hebrew term. It may have come from some other language and imported into Hebrew, and they kind of like, there was a close enough word. So, sorry, lots we don't know. There's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of questions, and not much in the way of answers. But what do we get from Genesis 6 about the Nephilim? Moses understands that people know something about these heroes called the Nephilim, and so he's going to tell you this is when the Nephilim lived. There you go. To try to correct their false mythology. All right, enough about the Nephilim. Going on to verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. Wow, isn't this the truth of man? Always wicked, all the time. However, it had been a growing problem. Things had not been this bad before, closer to the beginning. And Moses isn't blaming either of the sons of God or the Nephilim. After all, the sons of God seem to be spiritual beings, and the Nephilim, he doesn't even say anything negative about them at all. Whose fault is it? Humans. It's mankind. The wicked human heart is the problem. This ultimately is the issue. 6 and 7. And the Lord regretted what he had made man, that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Here's one of those great verses that you can go completely wrong if you make too much of it. The Lord regretted making man. The word nacham means to regret, to sigh, to grieve, or to repent. It's an emotional word. It refers to the emotion that comes with things going badly. It's not an intellectual word or a word of determination to push through the grief. It's the word of the grief itself. This isn't God saying, I blew it. This is God hurting in the midst of humans choosing poorly. Like a dad watching his kids leave home and make foolish decisions with their lives. Think of the father of the prodigal son grieving night after night as his son is gone in another country living stupidly. That father is not grieving because he made the wrong decision. He's grieving over the foolishness of the child in light of his decision. If only I had forced them to do the smart thing, but you can't do that. It's a strange thing to think about God going through pain, especially a pain like this. It brings God into the situation, into both the time and the place. Although God is intrinsically all places and naturally timeless, here he is in time and space hurting. He lives with us through those moments. He's joyful with us and sorrowful with us. He gets angry at our wicked choices, but he also hurts because of the consequences that are coming our way. So he truly hurts when, after bringing us into the world, he is stuck removing us when we turn foul. Oh, if only I hadn't made them. I hate cleaning them up. Now, why the animals? God's going to erase the animals and the creeping things and the birds of the heavens. Why? What did they do wrong? We talked about this before. The animals are part of the creation of man and woman. And they suffer the consequences that befall us because they belong to us. It's like if your house burns down because you do something foolish, your house eats the consequences. So does your cat and your dog. You shouldn't have burned your house down. It isn't fair to the animals. But the resolution isn't to point a finger at God for making animals for our benefit. It's to point the finger at ourselves for putting them into this position. They were our responsibility, and we blew it. We should have thought about that. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was what good was left on the earth. Now, this doesn't mean that Noah was a wonderful guy. It just means that he was what good was left. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Because, everyone else had gone awry. The rest of humanity was ruined. They were always evil all the time. So wicked had they become that the destruction of everything would become the only way to bring peace and rest back to the earth. That's how bad things were. Next time, we will conclude Genesis chapter 6.